The morning light filtered through the courtroom windows in soft, golden rays that seemed to mock Sarah's anxiety. She stood outside the federal courthouse in Portland, Oregon, her hand trembling as she held Max's leash. The building loomed before her, a monument of marble and authority, representing justice, fairness, and the promise that truth would prevail. Yet she'd learned over the past 2 years that truth was far more fragile than she'd ever imagined. It could be twisted, minimized, and dismissed by those with enough money and power. Sarah adjusted the collar of her blue suit for the 100th time that morning. She'd purchased it 3 weeks ago, unable to make a decision about something as simple as courtroom attire. Her therapist, doctor, had suggested that the suit represented armor, a physical manifestation of her readiness to fight. But Sarah knew the truth. The suit was a costume, and beneath it, she was terrified. Her hands had shaken so badly that morning that she'd nearly spilled her coffee twice. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours, her mind replaying the testimony she'd prepared, the questions she anticipated, the hostile stares she might face from the defendant and his legal team. 2 years, that's how long this nightmare had consumed her life. 2 years since that morning when she'd walked into her office at Westbrook Communications, a mid-sized marketing firm where she'd worked for 7 years, only to find her desk empty. Her supervisor, Richard, a man she'd once considered a mentor and friend, had informed her coldly that her services were no longer needed. No warning, no performance reviews indicating problems, no severance package. Just termination, effective immediately. She'd asked why. His answer was vague. It's not working out. When she pressed for details, he'd walked away, leaving her standing in the empty hallway, confused and humiliated. Later, she'd learned the real reason through a former colleague who'd felt guilty keeping silent. Sarah had reported to HR for sexual harassment 3 months prior. The touching that started as accidental, a hand on her shoulder that lingered too long, fingers brushing her back as he passed. The comments about her appearance that felt compliments but tasted like poison. The late-night text messages about projects, followed by increasingly personal questions. When she'd finally said no to his dinner invitation and explained that his behavior made her uncomfortable, she'd expected HR to handle it professionally. Instead, HR had done nothing, absolutely nothing, and within weeks she was fired, retaliation pure and simple. The first months after her termination had been a blur of confusion and desperation. She'd applied for dozens of jobs, but somehow word had spread throughout Portland's marketing industry. Had connections. Her name had been quietly blacklisted. She'd gone from a confident professional with a 6-figure salary to unemployed, her savings depleting rapidly, her confidence shattered. She'd lie awake at night, replaying every interaction with wondering if she'd somehow invited his attention, if she'd misinterpreted his intentions, if maybe she'd overreacted. The self-blame had been crushing, more painful in some ways than the harassment itself. Then came the panic attacks. The first one happened in a grocery store. She'd been reaching for yogurt when suddenly her chest tightened and she couldn't breathe. She'd collapsed in the aisle, convinced she was dying. Emergency room doctors found nothing physically wrong. Anxiety, they'd said, as if numbing it explained the terrifying sensation of her body rebelling against her. Panic attacks became a regular occurrence, triggered by emails, phone calls, the sound of a man's voice, even certain smells that reminded her of cologne. It was during her second panic attack, this one so severe that she'd called 911, that her sister had suggested therapy. That recommendation had changed everything. Doctor was direct, compassionate, and insistent that Sarah wasn't broken, she was traumatized. What happened to you was real, doctor had said during their first session, and Sarah had cried for the entire hour, finally hearing validation from a professional. Through therapy, Sarah had learned about her legal options. She'd consulted with 3 employment lawyers before finding a fierce advocate with a reputation for winning harassment cases, had reviewed her documentation, the emails had sent, the corroborating testimony from former colleagues, the HR records showing her complaint. "You have a strong case," had said, but she'd also been honest. "But it will be brutal. They'll come after you hard." And that's where Max entered her life. Doctor had suggested an emotional support animal during one of their sessions where Sarah had described her escalating anxiety. Not a pet, she'd emphasized. A trained emotional support animal. Sarah had been hesitant. She'd always loved dogs, but she'd never owned one. The training program, located 30 miles outside Portland, was intensive and expensive. But when she'd arrived for her first meeting with Max, she'd known immediately. He was a 3-year-old golden retriever with intelligent brown eyes and a gentleness that seemed almost supernatural. The trainers explained that Max had been trained to recognize signs of panic, rapid breathing, increased heart rate, muscle tension, and had been specifically taught to respond by grounding Sarah through pressure therapy. During their 18-month bonding period, Max had become far more than a trained animal. He'd become her witness to everything. He'd sat beside her bed during 3 a.m. panic attacks, his warm body pressed against her chest until her breathing normalized. He'd accompanied her to every therapy session, maintaining steady eye contact with her, somehow communicating that it was safe to be vulnerable. He'd walked with her through the dark days when she'd questioned whether fighting this battle was worth the emotional toll. Max never judged. He never suggested she was overreacting or being too sensitive. He simply existed beside her, a constant reminder that she wasn't alone in this struggle. Now standing outside the courthouse with Max by her side, Sarah took several deep breaths. She was dressed in armor, the blue suit, her hair carefully arranged, her makeup applied to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. In her leather briefcase, she carried 3 years' worth of documentation. Emails, text messages, HR complaints, medical records, therapy notes. Every piece of evidence that proved what happened to her was real and systemic and deliberately malicious. She looked at Max, who gazed back at her with those steady brown eyes, and felt something crystallize in her chest. This wasn't just about her anymore. Westbrook Communications had done this to her, but she knew through her lawyer that she wasn't alone. 3 other women had reported similar experiences with. 2 were terrified to come forward. If Sarah won this case, if she could prove that harassment and retaliation had cost her not just her job but her health, her confidence, her sense of security, maybe it would create a path for the others. She straightened her shoulders. The blue suit wasn't just armor, it was a statement. And Max, pressing his warm body against her leg, was her proof that she wasn't crazy, wasn't exaggerating, and wasn't alone. Together, they turned toward the courthouse doors. Today, they would fight for truth. Max wasn't an ordinary dog. That fact became abundantly clear the moment Sarah met him at the Pacific Northwest Emotional Support Animal Institute, a sprawling training facility nestled in the rolling hills 30 miles outside Portland. The center occupied a converted horse ranch with multiple training buildings, outdoor obstacle courses, and expansive fields where dogs of all sizes practiced their specialized skills. Sarah had driven out on a gray Saturday morning, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, uncertain whether this was the right decision. Doctor had recommended the program after Sarah's panic attacks had escalated to the point where she couldn't leave her apartment without feeling like her chest would explode. An emotional support animal isn't a pet, Doctor had carefully explained during one of their sessions. It's a medical intervention. The animal is trained to recognize specific indicators of distress and respond with particular techniques designed to interrupt your panic response. Some animals are trained for physical pressure therapy, others for grounding techniques. It's very specialized. Sarah had been skeptical. She'd heard about therapy dogs and emotional support animals, but she'd always imagined them as cuddly companions that made you feel better through general cuteness and affection. The reality was far more sophisticated. The Institute's director, a woman named Helen, no relation to Sarah's harasser, though Sarah had to suppress an ironic smile at the coincidence, had explained the program in detail during her initial consultation. We spend 18 to 24 months training each animal, Helen had said, leading Sarah through a tour of the facility. It's not just about teaching them commands, though that's part of it. It's about teaching them to read human physiology, heart rate changes, breathing patterns, muscle tension. Some dogs can sense a panic attack before the person even realizes one is starting. Sarah had watched through observation windows as trainers worked with various dogs. She'd seen a German Shepherd performing deep pressure therapy on a client, lying across her lap while she sat in a chair, the dog's weight seemingly absorbing the woman's anxiety. She'd seen a smaller poodle mix trained to circle a man who appeared to be experiencing dissociation, grounding him through constant physical contact. Each dog had been specially matched to their eventual owner's specific needs based on personality, size, and the type of trauma or condition they were trained to address. When Helen had led her into one of the training rooms and introduced her to Max, Sarah's breath had caught. He was a golden retriever, approximately 3 years old, with a coat the color of honey and eyes that seemed impossibly intelligent. Unlike some of the other dogs she'd seen, Max didn't approach her immediately with enthusiasm. Instead, he sat calmly, observing her with what could only be described as understanding. There was a gentleness to him that felt almost otherworldly, as if he could somehow perceive the damage inside her. Max was actually bred in-house, Helen had explained, running her hand along the dog's silky ears. His mother was one of our most successful emotional support animals. We retired her to a quiet home, but not before she passed on her incredible intuition to her offspring. Max is special. We don't match him with just anyone. Over the following weeks, Sarah had extensive interviews, evaluations, and medical assessments before the institute would officially match her with Max. They needed to understand her specific triggers, her panic responses, her lifestyle, her living situation. It wasn't enough to simply need emotional support. There had to be a profound compatibility between human and animal. The institute had explained that roughly 40% of potential matches failed because the human and dog weren't genuinely compatible, despite the training. But from Sarah's first bonding session with Max, everything felt right. The trainers had taught her specific techniques, how to recognize when Max was signaling distress, how to respond to his grounding behaviors, how to use him during panic attacks. One particular technique had been crucial. When Sarah felt panic rising, that tightening in her chest, the sensation of her airway closing, she was instructed to sit on the floor and allow Max to climb into her lap, his considerable weight pressing against her torso. This deep pressure therapy, the trainers explained, activated her parasympathetic nervous system, essentially telling her body to stand down from its emergency response. The first time Sarah had experienced a panic attack while Max was properly trained and bonded to her, the effect had been revolutionary. She'd been sitting in her apartment, reading news about workplace harassment statistics, when suddenly her chest had tightened and her vision had begun to blur. She'd called out Max's name, and immediately the dog had responded. He'd approached calmly and deliberately climbed into her lap, all 70 pounds of him, and simply rested his weight on her. Within minutes, Sarah's breathing had normalized. Within 15 minutes, the panic had entirely dissipated. She'd wept, but this time they were tears of relief. Over the 18 months of their bonding period, Max had become far more than a trained animal performing programmed responses. He'd become Sarah's anchor to reality, her witness to her own experience, her silent advocate. During therapy sessions with Dr. Max would sit beside Sarah's chair, occasionally placing his head on her knee, not because his training required it, but because he seemed to understand that she needed that particular gesture at that particular moment. Doctor had once commented that she'd never seen an animal so attuned to human emotional states. It's almost like he's reading your nervous system in real time, she'd observed. There had been nights when Sarah's PTSD had manifested as nightmares so severe that she'd wake up gasping, disoriented, convinced that was in her bedroom. On those nights, Max would already be pressing against her chest before she'd fully regained consciousness, his weight and warmth providing immediate reassurance. He seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to anticipate her needs. On days when Sarah felt so depressed that leaving bed seemed impossible, Max would nudge her repeatedly, insistently, until she rose and took him outside. The physical activity, the sunlight, the routine, these would gradually restore her to a functional state. The legal team preparing her case had been impressed by Max's presence and had recommended including documentation of his training and certification in her evidence portfolio. Judges see emotional support animals all the time now, her lawyer had explained. But they rarely see one with this level of formal training and demonstrated effectiveness. Max isn't just going to be your emotional support in court, he's going to be your. When you're sitting in that witness box and you're struggling, when you reach for him and he responds, the jury will see that your emotional responses are genuine. You're not performing. You're relying on a trained animal to help you manage a real medical condition. Sarah had obtained Max's complete training records, certification documents, and behavioral evaluations from the Pacific Northwest Institute. The paperwork was extensive and impressive. Detailed training logs, behavioral assessments, handler training certification for Sarah, medical evaluations proving her need for emotional support, and letters from doctor confirming the therapeutic necessity of Max's presence in her life. But standing outside the courthouse with Max's leash in her hand, Sarah understood something deeper than documentation could capture. Max wasn't just a trained animal fulfilling programmed responses. He was a living testament to her own validity. Every time he recognized her distress and responded, he was confirming that what she was experiencing was real, that her body's panic responses were legitimate reactions to genuine trauma. In a case where her word was going to be attacked and scrutinized, where the defense would do everything possible to make her seem unstable or exaggerating, Max represented absolute, undeniable truth. Animals couldn't lie. They couldn't perform emotion they didn't feel. And Max's calm, consistent presence beside her was perhaps the most powerful evidence that Sarah herself was telling the truth. The courtroom was precisely as intimidating as Sarah had imagined. Soaring ceilings, dark wood paneling, and an atmosphere of absolute authority permeated every corner. Judge presided from her elevated bench, her silver hair pulled back severely, her expression neutral and unreadable. The jury sat to the left, 12 ordinary people who would decide whether Sarah's life had been ruined or whether she was simply a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. The defendant, Richard, sat at the defense table wearing an expensive suit, his posture relaxed and confident, occasionally whispering to his legal team. Seeing him in person after so long made Sarah's stomach churn violently. She'd for the first hour with her own lawyer, who had walked her through the events chronologically and compassionately. The jury had seemed engaged, taking notes, nodding at appropriate moments. Sarah had managed to keep her voice steady, though her hands trembled as she described the progression from unwanted attention to overt harassment. She detailed specific incidents. The time had stood too close while reviewing her work, his hand resting on her shoulder in a way that felt proprietary and invasive. The evening he'd texted her about a project and then pivoted to asking about her dating life. The performance review where he'd complimented her intelligence and beauty in the same sentence, his voice carrying a tone that made her skin crawl. The jury had listened. She'd felt their attention, their sympathy, and then had said, "The witness is yours," and Richard had risen from his chair. Was everything Sarah had been warned about. 62 years old, distinguished silver temples, an air of absolute authority that suggested he'd never been wrong about anything in his entire life. He'd practiced law for 30 years and had a reputation for destroying witnesses. His strategy, had explained during trial preparation, would be to create doubt. Not necessarily about whether the incidents occurred, but about her interpretation of them, her credibility, her memory, her motivations. "Mr." the judge had acknowledged, and he'd approached the witness stand with the predatory grace of a hunter who'd done this 1,000 times. "Ms.," he'd begun, his voice smooth as honey and twice as poisonous. "You that my client, mister, placed his hand on your shoulder on the evening of March 14th, correct?" "Yes," Sarah had answered, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "And you characterized this as unwanted physical contact?" "It was, yes." "But you didn't tell him to move his hand, did you?" Sarah's throat had tightened. I was startled. I didn't know how to respond in the moment. "So you didn't verbally object, you simply felt uncomfortable." The way he'd said "felt uncomfortable" had been dripping with skepticism, as if her internal experience was irrelevant trivia. Sarah had looked at the jury, trying to gauge their reactions. Some of them were taking notes. Others looked sympathetic. But one juror, a man in his 50s with a stern expression, had been watching her with what seemed like doubt. The questions had continued, each one a small knife. Had asked her to recall exact times, dates, specific words had used. He'd pulled out transcripts and emails and asked her to verify that certain phrases had been included or excluded. When Sarah had hesitated or expressed uncertainty about minor details, he'd seized on it. "So you're not entirely sure about the date? You don't recall the exact wording? Is it possible you misunderstood his tone?" The insinuation had been clear and devastating. Sarah was unreliable. Her memory was questionable. She'd misinterpreted innocent interactions through the lens of her own bias. And perhaps the implication hung in the air like poison gas. She'd fabricated or exaggerated the entire story for financial gain. For 40 minutes, had hammered away at her narrative, not attacking it directly, but instead chiseling away at its foundations. By the time he'd asked about her performance reviews, "Your file shows that Mr. gave you a raise just 6 months before your termination, correct?" Would a genuine harasser do that? Sarah had felt her confidence crumbling like ancient stone. She'd looked down at her hands, which were visibly trembling. Her mouth had gone dry. The courtroom seemed to be closing in, the walls growing smaller, the air growing thinner. This wasn't what she'd expected. She'd been told that her story was strong, her evidence compelling, but was reframing everything, turning her truth into ambiguity, her legitimate complaints into. "Now, Ms.," had continued, consulting his notes with theatrical precision, "you mentioned receiving text messages from Mr. that made you uncomfortable. Can you describe the exact nature of these messages?" Sarah had pulled up the examples she'd brought, her hands shaking so badly she'd nearly dropped them. She'd read several aloud, her voice growing quieter with each one, as if the words themselves were diminishing her credibility. One message had read, "Hey, great work on the Henderson account. You're so smart. I'm glad you're on my team." Read in isolation, stripped of context and tone, it sounded almost complimentary. "And this message made you uncomfortable?" had asked, his eyebrows raised in exaggerated surprise. "Because it complimented your work." "It was the pattern," Sarah had tried to explain, "the context of everything else." "I'm asking you about this specific message," had interrupted smoothly. "Does this specific message contain anything harassment or inappropriate?" Sarah had struggled to articulate the insidious nature of the harassment. How it wasn't any single incident, but the cumulative effect of constant boundary violations. The way each compliment was wrapped in something more. The way she'd felt hunted rather than valued. But she'd noticed the jury's expressions shifting. Some of them looked confused, as if wondering why she was making such a big deal about what seemed like normal workplace communication. By the time I'd asked her about her mental health history, "You've been in therapy for how long? And you're currently taking medication for anxiety." Sarah's hands had been shaking visibly, and she'd felt tears threatening to spill. She'd been trying so hard to maintain composure, to project credibility, but strategy was becoming devastatingly clear. He was attempting to paint her as mentally unstable, someone whose perception of events couldn't be trusted because her brain was fundamentally unreliable. "I was in therapy because of what happened," she'd said quietly, but even as the words had left her mouth, she'd known how it sounded. The jury didn't know her. They didn't know that she'd been a high-functioning professional before. They didn't know that her anxiety had developed specifically as a response to harassment and retaliation. They only heard, unstable, medicated, potentially unreliable. The courtroom had felt impossibly hot. Sarah's vision had started to blur. She'd felt the familiar tightening in her chest that indicated an impending panic attack. She'd glanced toward the gallery where Max sat, wondering if she could just run to him, if she could abandon this nightmare and find safety in his steadfast presence. "No further questions at this time," had finally announced, returning to his seat with the satisfied expression of a predator who'd scored a successful kill. "The witness may step down." Sarah had felt utterly eviscerated. She'd answered his questions as honestly as she could, but somehow he'd twisted her narrative into something unrecognizable. She'd walked down from the witness stand on shaking legs, and as she'd approached the gallery, Max had immediately shifted his attention to her, his entire body language changing. He'd pressed against her as she'd sat down, and for the first time since had begun his cross-examination, Sarah had been able to breathe. That's when Judge had announced the recess. The 15-minute recess felt like a death sentence. Sarah sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, her back against the cold marble wall, Max pressed firmly against her left side. Her breathing was still erratic, her hands still trembling. Sat beside her, reviewing notes, occasionally making marks on her legal pad, her expression grave. "He was aggressive," had said, her voice matter-of-fact in the way that all experienced trial lawyers spoke when delivering difficult truths. "But that's expected. He's doing his job, creating doubt, casting you as unstable. Don't let it derail you. You were telling the truth up there, and the jury knows it, even if tried to obscure it." But Sarah didn't feel like she'd been telling the truth. She felt like she'd been disassembled, her story taken apart piece by piece until it no longer resembled the reality she'd lived. She'd looked at with something approaching desperation. "Did I do okay? Did they believe me?" Had squeezed her shoulder. "You did fine. Better than fine, actually. Most witnesses fall apart under that kind of pressure. You held yourself together. Now we just need to get through the rest of his cross-examination, and then we'll do redirect." But the prospect of returning to that witness stand, of facing contempt and skepticism again, had made Sarah's chest tighten further. She'd felt Max shift his weight, and she'd realized that he could sense her anxiety escalating. His training was kicking in. He was positioned to provide pressure therapy if needed, ready to interrupt her panic response if it worsened. Sarah had closed her eyes and tried to ground herself using the techniques Doctor had taught her. She'd counted 5 things she could see: the marble wall's red pen, Max's golden fur, the fluorescent courtroom lights visible through the glass doors, a painting of some long-dead judge on the opposite wall. 4 things she could touch: the cold floor beneath her, Max's warm body, her own damp palms, the fabric of her blue suit. 3 things she could hear: the distant murmur of conversations in other corridors, the hum of the building's climate control system, her own ragged breathing. It hadn't helped much. Had checked her watch, 5 more minutes, then we go back in. Sarah hadn't responded. She just sat there, feeling like a prisoner awaiting execution. The worst part was that she knew there was more coming. The recess was brief, designed only to reset everyone before resumed his assault. He would continue asking questions, probing for inconsistencies, attacking her credibility from every possible angle, and she would have to sit there and endure it, would have to maintain her composure while being systematically dismantled. When the court officer had appeared to usher them back inside, Sarah's legs had felt like they might not support her weight. She'd stood unsteadily and had gripped her elbow. "You've got this," had whispered. "Just remember you're telling the truth. Nothing he says can change that. Truth doesn't require permission or approval. It just is." The words had sounded nice, but they hadn't made Sarah feel any better. Back in the courtroom, Sarah had taken her place on the witness stand. Judge had resumed her position. The jury had filed back in, looking refreshed from their break, and Richard had stood, straightening his tie, preparing to continue his methodical dismantling of Sarah's credibility. "Now, Ms." he'd begun, consulting his notes again, "I want to return to the matter of your employment termination. You were terminated without warning, correct?" "Yes," Sarah had answered, her voice barely above a whisper. The next 45 minutes had been excruciating, had walked her through company policy regarding employment termination. He'd had her acknowledge that the employee handbook stated that at-will employment meant either party could terminate the relationship at any time for any reason. He'd questioned whether she'd ever received formal written warnings about her performance. He'd suggested that perhaps had concerns about her work quality that weren't documented in her reviews. He'd implied that she was conflating two separate events, her complaint about harassment and her subsequent termination, and assuming causation when none necessarily existed. "Isn't it true," he'd asked with calculated casualness, "that companies terminate employees for numerous reasons every day, and that your termination could have been based on simple business decisions rather than retaliation?" "But it wasn't," Sarah had said, her voice cracking slightly. "I know it was retaliation." "You know," had repeated, as if knowledge based on personal experience was somehow suspect. "But you have no direct evidence of Mr. state of mind at the time of termination, do you? No email where he explicitly states he's firing you because of your harassment complaint?" "No," Sarah had admitted miserably, "but 3 other women reported similar." "Those other women aren't testifying today," had interrupted. "I'm asking about your specific termination." Sarah's hands had gripped the edges of the witness stand. Her vision had started to blur again. The courtroom felt suffocating, walls closing in, air becoming scarce. She tried to focus on breathing, in through her nose, out through her mouth, but her anxiety had been escalating beyond her control. Then finally, mercifully, had paused. He'd walked back to his desk to consult with his paralegal, shuffling through documents, conferring in quiet tones about his next line of attack. For the first time in nearly an hour, there had been silence in the courtroom. The questioning had stopped. And in that moment of reprieve, Sarah's eyes had found Max in the gallery. He was sitting perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on her with an intensity that suggested he was reading her nervous system in real time. His posture was alert but calm, and something about his absolute steadiness had cut through her panic like a knife through water. In that instant, Sarah had made a decision. She'd leaned forward slightly, angling her body toward the gallery, and in a voice so quiet that perhaps only someone nearby would hear, she'd whispered the words that her heart desperately needed to speak. "I'm telling the truth. You know I'm telling the truth." It wasn't a statement directed at the court or the jury or anyone else in that room. It was a personal affirmation, a conversation between her and the only being who truly knew her, unfiltered and unperformed. Max's ears had perked up almost instantaneously, responding to the sound of her voice. And then, in a response that seemed almost choreographed by the universe itself, Max had released a soft, gentle whimper, not a bark, not an aggressive sound, but an acknowledgement, a confirmation, a canine testimony to her truth. That whimper had carried through the courtroom like a bell. Conversations had stopped. The court reporter had paused, her fingers hovering over her keys. Several jurors had turned to look at Max. Judge's head had lifted, and her eyes had focused on Sarah with an intensity that suggested she'd witnessed something significant. Even had looked up from his documents, his confident expression flickering for just a moment. The courtroom was absolutely silent, suspended in a moment that seemed to contain something profound, a truth that transcended words, that couldn't be twisted or reframed or cast in doubt. A woman, desperate and exhausted and terrified, had whispered her affirmation to the only witness who mattered, and that witness had answered. Sarah's chest had loosened slightly, her breathing becoming less labored. Max had settled back into his sitting position, his eyes still locked on hers as if he was saying, "I see you. I believe you. Your truth is real." And somehow, impossibly, that had made everything different. Judge had been presiding over cases for 22 years. In that time, she developed an almost supernatural ability to read people, to distinguish between genuine emotion and practiced performance, between truth and carefully constructed narratives. She'd watched thousands of witnesses testify, had observed countless legal tactics, had witnessed the full spectrum of human behavior under pressure. She prided herself on her objectivity, her ability to remain detached from the emotional content of cases and focus solely on the evidence and law. But what she just witnessed had penetrated that carefully maintained professional distance. She'd noticed Sarah from the moment the young woman had entered the courtroom. There was something in her posture that spoke to genuine fear rather than theatrical anxiety. The way her shoulders curved inward slightly, the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking, the desperate way she'd glanced at the dog in the gallery as if it were a life raft in a turbulent sea. Judge had presided over hundreds of harassment and retaliation cases, and she developed a keen eye for distinguishing between victims and opportunists. But was good, disturbingly good. She'd watched him systematically disassemble Sarah's testimony, not by attacking the substance of her claims but by undermining her credibility, suggesting her memory was faulty, implying her emotional state made her unreliable. It was in cross-examination, aggressive without appearing overtly hostile, skeptical without being dismissive, sophisticated enough to plant seeds of doubt in jurors' minds, without ever saying anything overtly prejudicial that she could strike from the record. Judge had seen many witnesses crack under that kind of pressure. Some became defensive and angry, which made them appear unstable. Others became overly emotional, which suggested they were being driven by feelings rather than facts. A few became so confused by the rapid-fire questioning that they contradicted themselves, which would inevitably highlight. She'd watched employ these tactics with the precision of a surgeon, and she'd seen jurors' expressions shift from sympathy to skepticism as he worked. But Sarah had done something different. She hadn't become defensive or angry. She hadn't dissolved into tears. She'd simply become quieter, more uncertain, more fragile. And that fragility had been authentic in a way that performances never were. Judge recognized it because she'd seen it before in genuinely traumatized individuals. That particular quality of someone whose sense of self had been damaged, who was struggling to articulate their own truth when powerful forces were suggesting that truth was negotiable. When had paused to consult with his paralegal, Judge had noted the moment. She'd been about to call for a brief recess. The jury's attention was flagging, and it seemed like a natural breaking point. But then something extraordinary had happened. Sarah had leaned forward. Her eyes had found the dog in the gallery, and she'd whispered something that was barely audible, something that most people in the courtroom probably hadn't even registered. But Judge had heard it. The acoustics of the courtroom, with its high ceilings and careful sound engineering, had carried that whisper directly to her elevated position. "I'm telling the truth. You know I'm telling the truth." And the dog had responded. Judge had seen service animals before. She'd approved accommodations for emotional support animals, therapy dogs, and psychiatric alert dogs. She understood their function and their value, but she'd never witnessed an interaction quite like this one. The way the dog's ears had perked up, the way it had immediately focused its entire being on Sarah, the way it had released that soft, knowing whimper, it hadn't been a trained response. It had been something deeper, something that suggested a profound attunement between human and animal that transcended programmed behavior. In that moment, Judge had experienced something she rarely allowed herself to experience in the courtroom, a visceral, emotional response. This wasn't a woman performing trauma for the jury's benefit. This wasn't a calculated attempt to manipulate sympathy. This was a human being in genuine distress, reaching for the one source of validation and stability in her life, and that source affirming her truth in a way that no words could replicate. The authenticity of that exchange had been absolute. Judge had served on the bench long enough to understand the legal concept of credibility. It wasn't just about whether a witness was technically accurate in every detail. It was about whether they were truthful in substance, whether their testimony reflected their genuine understanding of events. It was about integrity, and what she just witnessed was integrity in its most unguarded form. She'd seen Sarah lean forward, desperate and terrified, and whisper a truth that wasn't being spoken for the court's benefit or the jury's benefit. It was being spoken because Sarah needed to hear herself say it, needed external validation from the one being who knew her completely. And the dog's response had been the response of a creature incapable of deception, incapable of understanding the legal strategies and narrative frameworks that humans constructed. It had simply recognized its human's truth and affirmed it. Judge had felt her throat tighten. In 22 years of judicial experience, she'd learned to remain emotionally neutral. She'd learned that judges who allowed their feelings to influence their rulings were judges who made mistakes, who failed to treat all parties fairly, who let bias override judgment. But what she just witnessed had challenged her commitment to that neutrality. This young woman had been systematically dismantled by a skilled attorney. She'd been made to doubt her own memory, to question her own interpretation of events, to wonder if perhaps she was the problem, if her anxiety, her therapy, her need for an emotional support animal somehow made her perception of harassment invalid. She'd been subjected to exactly the kind of cross-examination designed to make traumatized people doubt themselves. And then she'd whispered a truth to the only witness who could validate it. Judge had made a decision in that moment. She decided that while she would continue to maintain judicial impartiality regarding the facts of the case, she would not allow her courtroom to become a venue for the systematic destruction of someone's credibility through sophisticated legal manipulation of emotional vulnerability. There were rules against that. There were standards of professional conduct. And there was something deeper than law. There was justice. She'd raised her hand. "Counsel, we're going to take a 15-minute recess," she'd announced, her voice carrying more authority than usual. She'd seen a brief flash of surprise. Recesses didn't typically occur mid-cross-examination without specific cause. But Judge had judged, and her judgment was that this witness needed protection, that the proceedings needed to be reset, that the court needed to signal that Sarah's testimony was not something to be casually deconstructed for tactical advantage. As Sarah had stepped down from the witness stand on shaking legs, Judge had made direct eye contact with her. She'd leaned forward slightly, ensuring her voice carried only to Sarah and those immediately nearby. "That took tremendous courage," she'd said quietly, her voice sincere and weighted with genuine respect. "The court recognizes that." It was a small gesture, barely noticeable to most of the courtroom. The jury had been focused on rising to exit for the recess, and his team had been gathering documents. But Sarah had heard it. Judge had seen tears spring into the young woman's eyes, not tears of fear or despair, but tears of relief, of validation, of being seen and acknowledged by someone with authority. Now, sitting alone in her chambers during the recess, Judge reflected on what she'd witnessed. She'd been a judge long enough to recognize authentic human struggle when she saw it. She'd presided over enough harassment cases to understand the particular way trauma manifested in testimony, the inconsistencies that came not from dishonesty, but from the fragmentation of memory that occurred when people experienced severe stress. She'd observed enough courtroom tactics to recognize when sophisticated legal strategy crossed the line from vigorous advocacy into subtle character assassination. And she'd made her decision. When court resumed, her rulings would reflect that decision. This witness had demonstrated genuine vulnerability, genuine integrity, and genuine truth-telling. The court would protect that. Retrié during the 15-minute recess, Sarah sat in a private consultation room that had secured. It was a small space with beige walls, a table, uncomfortable chairs, and fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly sickly. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on her shoe, providing quiet companionship while reviewed her notes and discussed strategy with her paralegal. His next line of attack will probably be the HR complaint, was saying, flipping through documents. He'll try to establish that you didn't follow proper procedures, that you didn't escalate through appropriate channels, that you had options you didn't pursue. Sarah wasn't really listening. She was replaying the moment Judge had spoken to her, that brief, quiet acknowledgement that had somehow penetrated the fog of her self-doubt. That took tremendous courage. The court recognizes that. The words had landed like a lifeline, temporary relief from the drowning sensation of being disbelieved. But she knew would return. The recess was just a pause, not a reprieve. There would be more questions, more insinuations, more subtle suggestions that she was unstable or exaggerating or fabricating details to support a predetermined narrative. The thought made her chest tighten again. Sarah was looking at her with concern. "Are you okay? We need to talk about what's coming next." Sarah had nodded mechanically. "I'm fine, just tired." "I know," had said, her expression softening. "But you're doing better than you think. Is throwing everything he's got at you and you're holding up. That matters. The jury is watching how you respond to pressure, and so far, you're showing them that you're telling the truth by virtue of how you're responding to being attacked." Sarah had wanted to believe that. She'd wanted to trust that her genuine distress was somehow evidence of her truthfulness rather than evidence of her instability. But cross-examination had planted seeds of doubt that were now growing like weeds in her mind. What if she was remembering things incorrectly? What if her anxiety was coloring her perception? What if the jury didn't believe her? The court officer had appeared in the doorway. Time to return to the courtroom. Sarah had stood on shaking legs. Max had immediately risen as well, pressing against her leg in a gesture of steadiness, had gathered her materials, and they'd walked back through the courthouse corridors toward the courtroom. Sarah had tried to center herself, tried to remember doctors' grounding techniques, tried to prepare mentally for another round of aggressive questioning. They'd entered the courtroom, and Sarah had taken her place on the witness stand once again. Judge had resumed her position. The jury had filed back in, and had stood, preparing to continue his cross-examination with presumably fresh vigor. But something was different. Judge's expression had shifted subtly. Her posture was slightly more forward, more attentive, and when had begun his next line of questioning, asking about Sarah's failure to document certain incidents in real time, something unexpected had happened. "Objection," Judge had said quietly, raising her hand before could even rise. "That question assumes facts not in evidence, counsel. Ms. Never that she failed to document incidents. She about what documentation she did create." Had looked momentarily thrown. "Your Honor, I'm simply asking about." "I understand what you're asking," Judge had interrupted, her voice polite but firm. "But the question as phrased contains a please rephrase." It was a small moment, barely noticeable. But Sarah had felt something shift in the courtroom's energy. The judge was protecting her testimony. Not in an obvious way, not in a way that would appear biased, but through careful application of procedural rules that prevented from being embedded into questions. Had rephrased his question. When Sarah had answered, he'd moved on to ask about her therapy records, had objected on grounds of privilege and relevance. Judge had sustained the objection, stating firmly that the plaintiff's mental health treatment is not relevant to whether the defendant's conduct constituted harassment. "But Your Honor," had protested, "her credibility is at issue." "Her credibility is at issue," Judge had agreed. "But her treatment for trauma-related anxiety is not probative of whether she's truthful about the harassment she experienced. The witness may be experiencing anxiety related to the events she's testifying about without that anxiety invalidating her testimony about those events." Over the next 30 minutes, As continued his cross-examination, Judge had intervened repeatedly. Not dramatically, not in ways that would appear obviously biased, but consistently. When had attempted to introduce a company email that Sarah had never seen before and asked her to interpret it, Judge had ruled it inadmissible hearsay. When had asked leading questions that suggested answers rather than seeking genuine testimony, Judge had sustained objections that hadn't been raised. When had attempted to have Sarah confirm statements about company policy that weren't within her personal knowledge, Judge had directed her to answer only regarding what she personally knew. Sarah had noticed the jury's reactions beginning to shift. They'd noticed the judge's protection of her testimony. They'd observed that Judge, an apparently impartial authority figure, was not allowing to systematically disassemble her credibility through technical manipulation. "Now, Ms." had asked, clearly frustrated by the judge's interventions, "when you reported this alleged harassment to HR, what was the specific name of the HR representative you spoke with?" "That line of questioning is not relevant," Judge had said before Sarah could answer. "We've established that HR was. The details of who specifically was are not material to whether harassment occurred." Had tried to push back. "Your Honor, with respect, the chain of command is relevant to whether the company." "The chain of command is relevant to liability," Judge had said calmly, "but we've already heard testimony about that. What I will not allow is another attempt to create inconsistencies in minor details as a way to suggest the witness is unreliable about substantive matters. The witness has consistently about the harassment she experienced. Counsel may continue with substantive questions, or we can conclude his cross-examination." It had been a clear boundary, had recognized it as such. He'd exchanged a glance with his paralegal, a glance that suggested frustration and recalculation. He'd continued his questioning, but his tone had shifted. He was no longer on the attack in quite the same way. Judge's consistent interventions had communicated to everyone in the courtroom that there were limits to how a witness could be treated, that protection of testimony integrity was part of judicial responsibility. After another 20 minutes had finally said, "No further questions, Your Honor." Sarah had felt her shoulders drop in relief. She'd survived. The cross-examination was over. "Ms." Judge had said, "you may step down. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock for redirect examination and closing arguments." As Sarah had walked from the witness stand, she'd felt fundamentally different than she had an hour earlier. Judge had made a choice to protect her, to establish that there were standards for how testimony could be challenged, to signal that Sarah's credibility was worthy of protection. It was subtle enough that any observer might not have noticed the shift, but Sarah had felt it viscerally. As she'd passed the defense table, Richard had been watching her with an expression that suggested he'd also noticed the shift. The confident smirk had faded. He'd looked worried for the first time since the trial had begun. Sarah had retrieved Max from the gallery, and they'd walked out of the courthouse together into the Portland afternoon, had caught up with her on the courthouse steps. "That was extraordinary," had said. "I've never seen Judge intervene that consistently during cross-examination. Something changed." Sarah had looked back at the courthouse, at the marble building that suddenly seemed less intimidating. Judge had seen her, not just seen her, but recognized something true about her, something worth protecting, and that recognition had changed everything. Sat alone in her chambers that evening, the city lights of Portland visible through her tall windows. The courtroom had emptied hours ago. The jury had been sent home for the day. The attorneys had packed their briefcases and departed. But Judge remained, as she often did after particularly significant trial days, reflecting on what had transpired. She'd presided over more than 2,000 cases in her 22 years on the bench. She prided herself on her objectivity, her ability to apply law fairly regardless of personal feelings about the parties or outcomes. She'd been trained in judicial ethics, had attended continuing legal education courses on bias and impartiality, had made countless decisions based on evidence and law rather than emotion. She understood that judges who let feelings influence rulings were judges who made mistakes, who created grounds for appeal, who failed in their fundamental duty to administer justice fairly. But sitting in her chambers now, reviewing her handwritten notes from the day's testimony, Judge confronted a difficult truth. She had allowed emotion to influence her rulings today. Not dramatically, not in ways that violated her ethical obligations, but genuinely. She had made choices about which objections to sustain, which lines of questioning to interrupt, which witness protections to invoke. And those choices had been motivated, at least in part, by what she'd witnessed during that whispered moment between Sarah and her dog. The question was whether that constituted judicial misconduct or judicial wisdom. Judge had seen many witnesses testify over her years on the bench. She'd observed genuine victims and manipulative liars. She'd watched skilled attorneys destroy credibility through legitimate cross-examination and through subtle character assassination. She developed an intuition about truthfulness that went beyond mere legal technicality. And in Sarah, she'd recognized something she rarely saw anymore: a human being telling the truth, struggling under pressure, but fundamentally honest. The whisper had been the confirmation, not because the words themselves were evidence. Technically, a private statement to a dog had no evidentiary value, but because of what that whisper revealed: a person so desperate to be believed that she sought validation not from the court or the jury, but from the one being who knew her completely. That was authentic vulnerability. That was truth speaking to truth. Judge had wrestled with the implications of that recognition all day. She'd intervened during cross-examination not because she was biased towards Sarah, but because she recognized that tactics, while technically legal, were designed to exploit that very vulnerability. He was using her genuine distress as evidence of unreliability rather than as evidence of genuine trauma. He was transforming her authenticity into ammunition against her. And Judge had decided that, while she would remain impartial about the facts of the case, she would not remain silent about the methods used to challenge those facts. That distinction was crucial. Judge reviewed the transcript from that day's proceedings, reading through her own rulings. Each one could be justified on technical grounds. The objection was proper. The hearsay ruling was correct. The exclusion of irrelevant mental health information was appropriate. Every single intervention she'd made was defensible under rules of evidence and procedure. But the pattern of interventions sent a message. This witness deserves protection. This witness's testimony is worthy of careful consideration rather than dismissal through technical manipulation. Judge had seen what happened when judges failed to provide that protection. She'd read appellate opinions in other cases where trial judges had sat silently, while powerful attorneys systematically destroyed vulnerable witnesses through sophisticated but ethically questionable tactics. The result was that justice often went to the party with the better lawyer rather than to the party with the better case. She'd also seen cases where judges overprotected witnesses, making rulings so obviously favorable to one party that reversals on appeal were inevitable. That wasn't the path Judge wanted to walk either. But somewhere in between, somewhere in the space between allowing witnesses to be destroyed through manipulation and actively collaborating in that destruction, there was room for a judge to enforce standards. Standards about how questions could be phrased. Standards about relevance and materiality. Standards about the difference between vigorous cross-examination and character assassination disguised as fact-finding. Judge made a decision. Tomorrow, when trial resumed for redirect examination and closing arguments, she would continue to enforce those standards. She would protect the integrity of the testimony by ensuring that facts were established through proper evidence rather than through clever question phrasing. She would not allow the rules of evidence and procedure to become weapons against truth. But she would do it carefully, methodically, making sure that every ruling could withstand appellate scrutiny. Because if this case went to appeal, and with resources it probably would, Judge wanted her rulings to be bulletproof. She pulled out her computer and drafted detailed written explanations for each ruling she'd made that day. This level of documentation was unusual. Most judges simply stated rulings from the bench. But Judge wanted a record so clear that no appellate court could possibly suggest she'd acted with bias. She wrote, "Objection sustained because question assumes facts not in evidence regarding plaintiff's documentation practices. Question should be rephrased to seek actual testimony rather than embed suggested answers." She wrote, "Hearsay ruling sustained. Company email sent to third parties regarding business decisions does not establish plaintiff's knowledge of those decisions. Hearsay exception for business records does not apply." It took her 2 hours to document each ruling with sufficient detail to withstand scrutiny. When she finished, she sat back in her chair, satisfied. She protected Sarah's testimony through proper application of law and procedure. There was nothing unethical about that. There was nothing biased about that. There was only justice being administered carefully and fairly. Judge thought about the jury. They'd noticed the shift in her rulings. She'd seen it in their expressions, in the way they'd stopped looking sympathetic to suggestions and started looking like they were actually evaluating the evidence rather than accepting whatever framework tried to impose. That was good. Juries were supposed to evaluate evidence critically. They were supposed to distinguish between substance and manipulation. She thought about, and the defense team. They'd recognize that their tactics had been limited today. They'd recalculate their strategy. Was experienced enough to understand that he wasn't going to win this case through character assassination. If they wanted to win, they'd need to find genuine weaknesses in Sarah's evidence rather than manufacturing them through clever questioning. And she thought about Sarah, sitting somewhere in Portland tonight with her dog, probably exhausted and emotionally depleted. Judge hoped that Sarah would feel, when she returned to court tomorrow, that the legal system was capable of recognizing truth and protecting it. That was what the rule of law was supposed to provide. Not just technically correct procedures, but actual justice. Not just formal impartiality, but substantive fairness. Judge turned off her office lights and prepared to leave the courthouse. Tomorrow would be challenging. There would be redirect examination and closing arguments. The jury would begin their deliberations. Justice would move closer to resolution, and Judge would continue to enforce the standards she'd established, not favoring either party, but ensuring that the truth that emerged would be genuine truth, not manufactured through legal manipulation. She locked her chamber's door and walked through the empty courthouse hallways toward the exit. As she passed the courtroom, she paused and looked through the glass doors at the empty space where Sarah had. Somewhere in that room, a truth had been spoken. Somewhere in that room, a woman had whispered her integrity to the only witness who could validate it. And somewhere in that room, a judge had recognized that protecting that truth was part of her fundamental duty. Judge stepped out into the Portland night air, feeling the weight of her responsibility but also feeling the rightness of her choices. Tomorrow would bring the next chapter. But for now, she was satisfied that she'd done her job, not perfectly, because perfect impartiality was an impossible standard, but fairly. She'd protected the integrity of the proceedings while remaining faithful to the law. That was what judges were supposed to do. The third week of trial arrived with unseasonable warmth and brilliant sunshine streaming through the courthouse windows. Sarah sat in the gallery with Max beside her, feeling oddly detached from the proceedings unfolding before her. Was conducting redirect examination, walking her through the testimony she'd already given but from a different angle, asking her to explain her emotional state, to contextualize her anxiety within the framework of genuine trauma rather than as evidence of unreliability. "When you whispered to Max during the cross-examination," asked gently, "what were you thinking in that moment?" Sarah had glanced at the jury, then back at. "I was thinking that I needed to remind myself of what was true. Questions had made me doubt myself so much that I needed to hear myself say the truth out loud, even if it was just to Max. I was terrified that the jury didn't believe me, that I'd somehow failed to convince them that what happened was real. And why did you turn to Max specifically? Because Max knows me, Sarah had said, her voice steady for the first time in days. He's been with me through all of this. He knows when I'm telling the truth and when I'm not, because he can read my body, my heart rate, my genuine emotional state. When I whispered to him, I wasn't performing. I was just being honest, and he responded to that honesty. Judge had been watching Sarah closely during redirect, and Sarah had noticed something. The judge's expression was one of profound recognition. It was as if understood exactly what Sarah meant about seeking validation from authenticity itself, rather than from the constructed frameworks of legal argument. After redirect, had opted not to conduct recross-examination. His team had made a strategic decision to avoid further interaction with Sarah, likely fearing that additional questioning would only reinforce the impression that they were attempting to destroy a credible witness through manipulation. The closing arguments had been compelling on both sides, had stood before the jury and argued that Sarah's case was built on circumstantial evidence and emotional reaction, rather than concrete proof of intentional harassment. He'd suggested that behavior, while perhaps occasionally awkward, was not harassment, but rather the actions of a supervisor who had been friendly with his employees. He'd emphasized the lack of explicitly sexual comments, the absence of physical contact beyond brief shoulder touches, the presence of a raise 6 months before termination. The question before you, had concluded, is whether we're prepared to criminalize normal workplace friendliness, whether a supervisor who compliments an employee's intelligence and appearance is necessarily engaging in harassment, whether a termination, without explicit documentary evidence of retaliatory motive, constitutes retaliation. I submit to you that the answer to all of these questions is no. Then had stood, she'd been quiet, measured, powerful. What we've witnessed in this courtroom, had begun, is a pattern, not one incident that could be misinterpreted, but a consistent pattern of boundary violations by someone in a position of power over someone without power. We've heard testimony from corroborating witnesses. We've seen documentary evidence in the form of text messages and emails. We've observed a young woman, traumatized by that pattern, struggling to articulate her experience while being systematically attacked for the very trauma that pattern created. Had paused, letting that sink in. The defense wants you to believe that anxiety is disqualifying, had continued. That trauma makes someone unreliable. That genuine distress is evidence of dishonesty. But that's not how human beings work. When people experience real trauma, they become anxious. When they're attacked for reporting harassment, they become fearful. Miss Anxiety is not evidence against her. It's evidence for her. It's evidence that what she experienced was real and damaging, and serious enough to cause lasting psychological harm. Had looked directly at the jury. You have a choice in this case. You can choose to believe that a woman's trauma disqualifies her from being believed, or you can choose to believe that trauma is exactly what we should expect from someone who's experienced what Ms. experienced. I urge you to choose the latter. I urge you to recognize that Sarah is telling you the truth, and that truth deserves your protection. The jury had deliberated for 6 hours the first day, continuing through the morning of the second day. Sarah had spent those hours in a state of suspended anxiety, unable to work or think or do anything except exist in limbo. She'd walked the courthouse grounds with Max, sat in the courthouse cafeteria, tried to read but couldn't focus. Had assured her that lengthy deliberations were not necessarily negative. They suggested the jury was taking the case seriously rather than rendering a snap judgment. On the second afternoon, the court had been that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom had filled quickly. Sarah had taken her place at the plaintiff's table, Max settling beside her. Judge had taken the bench. The jury had filed in, and Sarah had studied their faces trying to divine the verdict from their expressions. Some juries avoided eye contact with the losing party. Others appeared sympathetic regardless of their verdict. This jury's faces were unreadable. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge had asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman, an elderly man with kind eyes, had said. The tension in the courtroom had been nearly suffocating. Sarah's hands had gripped the table so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She'd felt Max press against her leg, grounding her. "On the charge of sexual harassment in the workplace, how do you find?" "We find for the plaintiff," the foreman had said clearly. Sarah's breath had caught. She'd heard the words but hadn't quite processed them. "On the charge of retaliation in violation of the Civil Rights Act, how do you find?" "We find for the plaintiff." "On the charge of emotional distress, how do you find?" "We find for the plaintiff." The courtroom had erupted. Several jurors had appeared to be wiping away tears, had squeezed Sarah's hand so hard it hurt. Sarah had felt her own tears spilling over, not tears of relief exactly, but tears of validation, of vindication, of her truth finally being recognized by a body of her peers. Judge had conducted the poll, asking each jury member individually if they agreed with the verdict. All 12 had affirmed. Then she'd thanked them for their service and dismissed them. As they'd filed out, several had nodded at Sarah. One woman had made direct eye contact and smiled. 3 weeks later, Judge had issued her written ruling on damages. She'd awarded Sarah back pay for the 2 years she'd been unemployed, plus front pay for future lost earnings. She'd awarded substantial compensatory damages for emotional distress. She'd awarded punitive damages against Westbrook Communications for the egregious nature of their retaliation. The total exceeded $2.3 million. But more importantly, in her written opinion, Judge had written, "This court was impressed by the remarkable honesty and credibility demonstrated throughout Ms.'s testimony. In particular, this court observed that Ms.'s emotional responses were not indicators of unreliability, but rather authentic manifestations of genuine trauma." The court notes that witness credibility is not diminished by emotional distress related to the events being about. Rather, such distress is often probative of truthfulness. Ms.'s testimony withstood rigorous cross-examination not because she was emotionless or artificially composed, but because the substance of her account remained consistent despite the emotional toll of reliving traumatic events. Judge had also included a section addressing and Westbrook Communications directly. This court is troubled by the pattern of conduct described in Ms.'s testimony. Moreover, this court is concerned that the defense's strategy in this case, attempting to use the plaintiff's legitimate trauma responses as evidence of unreliability, represents a systematic approach to silencing victims of workplace harassment. Such tactics are precisely why victims often do not come forward. This court will not allow its courtroom to become a venue for such silencing. Sarah had walked out of the courthouse on the day the written opinion was released with Max by her side and beside her. The Portland media had picked up the story: woman wins major harassment judgment. Judge praises her courage. Several of the other women who had experienced harassment at Westbrook Communications had reached out to Sarah afterward, indicating they were considering their own claims. But what mattered most to Sarah wasn't the money or the publicity. What mattered was that she could breathe again. She could sleep through the night without panic attacks. She could walk through the world without feeling like she was carrying unbearable shame for something that wasn't her fault. She'd used some of the settlement money to establish a legal defense fund for harassment victims. She'd returned to work in a new marketing firm where she felt valued and safe. And she'd started a blog documenting her experience, titled What the Dog Knew, about the intersection of trauma, credibility, and the importance of witnesses, human and animal, who validate our truth. Most importantly, she'd learned something fundamental about herself. She was stronger than she'd believed possible, not because she'd won a lawsuit, though that mattered, but because she'd stood in a courtroom, terrified and traumatized, and refused to let her fear silence her truth. She'd whispered that truth to a dog when she couldn't say it loud enough for anyone else to hear, And that moment of radical honesty had somehow changed everything. Judge had occasionally thought of Sarah in the months that followed. She'd read about the Legal Defense Fund, had seen Sarah's blog posts. She'd felt satisfaction knowing that her careful, methodical approach to protecting witness credibility had contributed to a genuine outcome of justice. Sarah and Max became fixtures in Portland's trauma recovery community. Sarah spoke at universities about workplace harassment. She worked with therapists to train other emotional support animals, and she lived her life, finally, as someone whose truth had been recognized and validated. The story of the woman who whispered to her dog in court spread beyond Portland. It appeared in national legal publications as a case study in witness credibility. It was discussed in law schools as an example of how judges could protect truth while remaining impartial. And it became, for many survivors of harassment and trauma, a symbol that authenticity and vulnerability, far from being weaknesses to be exploited, were actually sources of profound strength. Sarah never forgot the moment Judge had looked at her and said, "That took tremendous courage. The court recognizes that." She'd been validated by the court system, by a jury of her peers, and by her own journey of healing. But perhaps most importantly, she'd been validated by Max's unwavering recognition of her truth. In the end, that had mattered most of all. Retry can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.